morning, YouTube. This is going to be my first video response out of 3, hopefully. This one going to Rob the Monk, in relation to my opening statements in the Presumption of Atheism, which was a collaborative process between Dawahfilms, Veritas, 48, and myself. So let's jump in. What I like about Rob the Monk's video response is that it is focused on the important issue at hand, and that is whether absence of evidence is evidence of absence and serves as some sort of justification for atheism's non-belief. Now, Rob states at around 39 seconds that, quote, "The adoption of the principles summarized in the aphorisms, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, should not entail an atheist worldview of the weak, negative, or passive variety. I think the adoption of this principle should lead one to the atheism of the positive or strong variety," end quote. Now, Rob's video response hits the nail on the head when he focuses on the absence of evidence and not the definition of atheism. Now, my dichotomy argument I presented in my original video was to suggest reason as to why the atheist of any stripe must provide justification for his non-belief. Now, Rob comes at this dichotomy from the positive atheist camp when he argues that, in sum, given the truth that there are often exceptions to informal fallacies, then what follows is that the move from absence of evidence to evidence of absence is not necessarily an argument from ignorance, as I argued in my opening statement, that is, from a positive atheist definition. He gives the example of my probable disbelief of the president standing next to me in support of this. What I'm going to do in this video response is grant, for the sake of argument, that the famous chink in induction, as Rob calls it, is in fact universally applicable and move the conversation forward. Here, Rob also suggests that it is important to question when the absence of evidence is indeed evidence of absence, and he offers a clarifier, namely that such a proposition is true when the search for the being or object has been sufficiently thorough. Again, I agree with Rob, for I also stated such a clarifier when I quoted the atheist philosopher Michael Scriven and his 2 criteria of 1, God is not something that might leave no traces behind, and 2, we have comprehensively surveyed the area where the evidence would be found if the entity existed. So in other words, in order to be in a good epistemic situation to infer from the absence of evidence to know God, you must meet the dual criteria of evidence and knowledge expectation. However, it is here where my agreement with Rob stops. He argues that he is forced to be an agnostic with respect to a God who is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, for example, because such a definition is nebulous, inconceivable, and utterly trivial, since one cannot tell if such a being exists or does not exist. He asks, how could one ever be expected to provide evidence for such a claim? He asks us to imagine a belief for which no good supporting reason can be given for one to adopt it. So concisely, he seems to be arguing that one cannot provide evidence for or against such a being because of the inherent definition of that being. So here I have a few thoughts in response. Initially, it would be good to establish where we are in this discussion, I think. Rob and I both agree that one should offer justification for their beliefs and skip over peripheral arguments of the definition of atheism. Moreover, Rob and I both agree that in the absence of evidence, there appears to be criteria that must exist in order to justify the move from absence of evidence to evidence of absence. Hence, we are talking about the absence of evidence as justification for non-belief. Now I will turn to my response to Rob specifically. First, it was not my intention to convey an arbitrary definition of God, for I'm arguing for the theistic definition of God, and I provided several predicated attributes of that being, namely timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal, etc. Moreover, in my attempts to provide arguments that God does not meet the criteria of knowledge and evidence, I used 2 arguments from a hypothesis confirmation in order to establish that given the falsity of theism, atheism does not necessarily follow without argument. To the first point about God's definition, this is in no way a conglomeration of attributes that evolved over time, but rather it is the classical definition of God given. Moreover, such attributes as timeless, spaceless, and immaterial are necessary, for if God was none of these, then he could not be considered the personal creator of the universe, for then he would be in conflict with current scientific and philosophical data. So concisely, this is not my own argument from ignorance. Rather, it is the classical definition of the theistic hypothesis, or bluntly, this is what the theistic God is defined and like. Second, it is important to emphasize that the theistic concept of God can be proved and provided with supporting reason in either direction. For example, if one wishes to offer reason to disprove the theistic God, then one can either 1. Demonstrate that the concept of the theistic God is incoherent, or 2. Demonstrate that there are events in the universe that ought not to be the case given the existence of the said being. These 2 tactics are often appealed to when positive arguments are given against the theistic God. For example, the incoherence of theism or the argument from evil. However, if one wishes to offer support for the existence of such a being and positive rational evidences for him, then they could appeal to such things as the appeal to events that are not explicable via naturalistic worldview, or argue for the first mover or a cosmological biological design, or even argue from testimony and personal experience. Again, these are tactics that allow for evidence to be brought in support for the theistic God. So concisely, then, I would disagree strongly with Rob that the theistic God is one that by definition cannot be either supported or rejected by rational argument. Third, atheists must address the two criteria that Michael Scriven gave as quoted in my opening statement. Scriven argued that atheists must offer reasons to why God meets the criteria of knowledge expectation, meaning that we should expect to know evidence of God, and to evidence expectation, meaning that we should expect to have evidence of God. As I originally stated in my opening statement, atheists would need to demonstrate that God meets said criteria, and no arguments were given by Rob other than the alleged problematic attributes of the theistic God to which I have responded. Fourth, it is important to note that these criteria are necessary conditions for being in a good epistemic situation for denying the existence of something. They are not sufficient conditions. In other words, to say that the two criteria listed above are necessary conditions means that if those criteria are not met, then the denial of the existence of an object, let's say God, is unjustified. This is not a sufficient condition, meaning that if the two criteria are met, one is not obligated to deny an object's existence, since a theist may be compelled by a positive argument for the existence of God. This is an important point, for it again demonstrates that positive arguments for atheism are required. Assuming that the criteria are not met, then only in light of positive arguments against God's existence would the atheist have justification to remain an atheist. Hence, it seems that even if we are to assume for the sake of argument that the atheist could offer compelling reasons as to why God meets these two criteria and be justified, his view is still problematic since this is a necessary and not sufficient condition. In other words, the alleged justification still might not follow with the necessary versus sufficient distinction, as the justification is not obligated to follow in light of other contrary arguments. Fifth and lastly, the theist must offer reasons as to why God does not meet these two criteria of knowledge and evidence expectation. Hopefully it will be remembered that I argued against such a notion in my original video, where I argued 1. Such tactics seem to be a move from a dubious inductive premise to a universal claim. 2. The atheist must establish that the two criteria hold. And 3. Only a positive argument would establish atheism over theism in light of other hypotheses, for example, pantheism or agnosticism. Allow me to offer one more argument. Given that the future progress of knowledge requires present ignorance, it would seem that we should not expect to have evidence for God, as our current understanding could be incomplete or false. Thus, the evidence and knowledge criteria are not met. Thanks, Rob, for your video response.